Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching the Lab 1 video for Server 2003 DNS. If you watched the lab setup video, you got a real good feel for what exactly we're going to be doing in this Lab 1 video. Okay, and to give you an idea of the network that we're working with right now, we're going to be working with a company named WiredBrainCoffee.com, and we're just going to be setting up a basic DNS structure. Okay, and throughout Lab 1 and Lab 2, we're just going to focus on the DNS concepts, how to get the structure up and running for what we see right here. When we get into Lab 3 and 4, we're going to focus more on how to integrate our internal DNS with the external DNS, and we'll kind of do a little case study / scenario and get the whole thing functioning and up and running at once. Okay, so in Lab 1 right now, though, we're going to be focusing on Server 1 right here at 192.168.1.100. We'll be doing some basic DNS setup and then testing from XP1. Now, what we're going to do in this lab, first we're going to focus on DNS installation options. Then we'll move on to what DNS suffixes are. And then from there we're going to go into forward lookup zones, reverse lookup zones, host and PTR records. Then we'll move forward into the DNS client configuration and do some basic testing using the NS lookup command. All right, let's first get started by connecting over to our Server 1 machine using a remote desktop connection. So we'll be connecting over to Server 1 here. Okay, and what we're going to do here first is talk about the different ways we can install DNS. Now, when you first install a Windows Server 2003 machine, one of the first screens that pops up is the add a role or server roles, wizard, add a role to your server wizard. We're going to take a look. We're just going to pull this back up here again. And to do this, we'll just click up here on Manage Your Server. And we do this. This is the screen I'm talking about right here. And it asks us about adding roles to this particular server. And what we can do is click on Add or Remove a Role. Okay, and here's some preliminary steps. We need to make sure that it's completely plugged in and available. But when we click Next here, what it does is it checks the local configuration to see exactly what is or is not configured. Okay, and you're going to see here in a second, there's not much at all configured on this system because we haven't done much with it. You know, we've set up some basic IP address settings and not too much else. Now, this is one way we can do this. I don't personally prefer doing this method because you don't really know what you're getting. As you're going to see here in a second, it tells us what we have configured, and as I said, there's nothing configured on this machine. And you pretty much take a stab in the dark and you just click one of these buttons, DNS server, for example, since that's what we're going to do. Then we click Next, okay, and if we click Next and finish again, what it's going to do is install DNS how they think we want it. Okay, and me personally, I'd rather learn how to do this, know what's going on. It's going to make it a heck of a lot easier to troubleshoot, and you're going to have a better chance of getting it right the first time. Okay, so this is one way of installing DNS. I don't recommend it, however. Now, a second way would be if you're going through the DC promo process. We'll go through this here a little bit. Okay, if you're going through the DNS DC promo process here, you get to a certain point within this wizard. We're not going to go through all the way here, so we're just clicking through this rather quickly. But we're going to get to a point where it's going to ask us if we'd like to install DNS. Okay, and I just want to show this screen to you momentarily here. It'll just take 2 more screens and we should be there. Okay, here we see a diagnostic result that lets us know that they weren't able to find a DNS server that tested out and found this wbc.com zone. Okay, and what we could do here is click Install and configure the DNS server on this computer and set this computer to use this DNS server as its preferred DNS server. Now, this works reasonably well, okay, and you could go ahead and do this if you're going to indeed make this machine a domain controller, and it would probably be successful. It is more successful than it was in Windows 2000. Windows 2000, they kind of had an annoying little side effect that took place if you went through and used this method. Okay, so this would be the second way you could install DNS onto a server. Today, we're going to focus on the manual method. Okay, how do you actually install DNS? Because if you know how to do it this way, then it's going to be much, much simpler. The other 2 ways will be a piece of cake for you, and you'll know how to troubleshoot a DNS server in case there's an issue, you know, where somebody installed it the automated way like we just showed. Okay, first things first, we need to go into Add and Remove Programs. We're going to go to Control Panel. Okay, and then up here we have Add Remove Programs, and we're going to click on Add Remove Windows Components. Now this will take a second here to open up, but once it does, we're going to go into the Networking Services, and we're going to install DNS on this particular machine. Okay, and they have changed stuff around here a little bit in Server 2003. However, DNS is still found in the same place as it was in Windows 2000 within Networking Services. And I want to stress to you, just to make sure, do not click this, because when you check this, you get everything underneath here, and we really don't want that. That makes this system less secure and more of a pain to manage. So we're going to deselect here, double click over here on Networking Services anywhere, or you can click Details, either one will work, and select the individual service that we want to install, which in this case is the Domain Name System DNS. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK here. I'll click Next, and this is typically where it's going to prompt you for the CD. It doesn't currently have this software installed, so you'll see here in a second it should prompt us for the CD unless I left that CD in there. Okay, and no, I didn't. Okay, so what we'll do here, I'm going to go ahead and stop this video here momentarily, and I'm going to put the CD in. We'll finish this up, and we'll pick up again once it's done installing. Okay, DNS has finished installing here, so we're going to go ahead and click Finish, and we're all set here. We can go ahead and close out this Add Remove Components window since it's done setting up. Okay, so if we look here now and we go to Start All Programs, Administrative Tools, we'll see that DNS has just been installed, and in addition to that, we can now manage it here on this server. So when I open this up, we get a good feel for now what the DNS console looks like. Pretty much the same as it was in Windows 2000. We have our forward lookup zones, reverse lookup zones. Currently there's none configured, so we see nothing underneath here. One thing we do see that's new, however, is this Event Viewer tool. This wasn't in Windows 2000. And what this gives us, this is just a little segment of our complete event viewer. If we go to Start Programs, Administrative Tools, Event Viewer, you'll see the 4 or 5 different system logs or logs that are part of the normal event viewer. We've just pulled out the DNS settings from that particular piece. Okay, and right now, if we read through here, nothing major right now. No DNS domain name on this. We'll talk about that next here. Okay. Did not detect any zones. DNS server has started. So just informational stuff right now. Okay, let's go ahead and minimize this. And what we want to talk about briefly is the DNS suffix. Okay, and this is something we talked about in Windows 2000 as well. But if you go to computer name here, then we go over to change, we have to go to the more setting. But here we have what's called a primary DNS suffix. Now normally, this is not something that you're always going to have to worry about. If server 1 was a domain controller, this setting would be taken care of. We wouldn't really have to worry about it at all. This would be appended. We wouldn't have to worry about it. If server 1 was joining a domain, so it was going to be a member server, same thing. It would automatically add the suffix that we're going to add in here in a second. Okay, so to kind of sum this up, usually this won't be an issue for you. When it does become an issue is if you're dealing with a server that's out on a public DNS domain, like we're going to be dealing with in Lab 3 and 4, or if you're setting up DNS similar to how we're setting it up right now, just a simple workgroup environment where we're not setting it up in a domain. Okay, and let me add this in here. Okay, this is the domain name we're going to be working with, wiredbraincoffee.com. This is the actual DNS domain name that we'll be working with. So what's going to happen, together with this NetBIOS computer name and the primary DNS suffix, we're going to form a fully qualified domain name, or the full name of this machine, and it's going to be server1.wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, now in doing this, what it's going to allow us to do is use DNS and perform DNS name resolutions here in a second when we set up our forward lookup zones. If I didn't configure this on this machine, okay, this machine would not be part of wiredbraincoffee.com. It would just be server 1 here, and it would just be part of this root namespace. It would be nothing else. It wouldn't be within this zone. Okay, so let's go ahead and click OK here. Okay, and what we're going to get in a second is we're going to have to restart this computer. Okay, so I'm going to click OK, and we'll click OK again. And this is really just going to boot us off this particular machine, server 1, take us back to our base system, and then we'll stop the video, let that reboot, and once the system has come back up again, we'll start up from there, we'll connect back over to server 1, and then talk about why this is important. Okay, server 1 is booted back up again, so we're going to connect back over to the system, and what we'll do here is just talk about the primary DNS suffix once again, and we'll double check to make sure the setting actually took place on server 1. Okay, so it'll take a second here to get back up. It's still churning away after booting up here. But we're just going to right click, and this is the equivalent of My Computer, don't forget. Okay, and then once this comes up, we'll go over to the second tab from the left, computer name. Okay, then we'll take a look right here at full computer name. We now see the name of this computer, server1.wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, and this is what I was speaking of before. If we didn't add this primary DNS suffix in here, what we'd end up with, we just have server 1. It wouldn't be part of any of this stuff here. Okay, and this is important, probably not to us yet, but you'll kind of get a better feel for this when we go into setting up our forward lookup zone like we're going to do right now. Okay, so we're going to go back into our DNS tool. And now we're going to walk through the process of setting up a forward lookup zone, and this will be set up, of course, for wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, and the purpose of this, why you may end up doing this, well, you could set up DNS internally on a network, and this is how you'd go about doing it. Or if you're setting it up externally on a public namespace, you could do the exact same thing. We'd go through and we'd set up a forward lookup zone using wiredbraincoffee.com if that was the name we wanted to use to resolve down to IP addresses. So we click on right-click forward lookup zone, then go to New Zone. And this takes us to the New Zone wizard, which is going to be somewhat similar to what you saw in Windows 2000. In Server 2003, there are a couple different choices, and we'll talk about those. Okay, we're going to create a primary zone or a secondary zone. Okay, and let's focus on this right now. If we read this, it says creates a copy of a zone that can be updated directly on the server. And this is a little bit misleading here when it says copy. Normally, when we say copy, we're talking about a copy of something else. In this case, we're creating a brand new DNS zone, a DNS database. And recall that a primary zone, this is the one that we must create first. If we chose secondary zone here, okay, we'd have nothing to connect to, because when we go through this, it's going to ask us for the primary zone that we want to copy over to the secondary, and we don't have one configured yet. Okay, and we're going to do that in Lab 2. We'll set up a secondary zone, and we'll copy the data that we're actually configuring right now. Okay, so we're going to leave this selected as primary zone. A couple other options to see down below. A stub zone, we're going to talk about this. This is a new feature in Server 2003. This will be covered in Lab 3 when we go through and we set up forwarders. We'll talk about why we might want to use a stub zone instead. And then this option down below, store the zone in Active Directory. Notice this is grayed out right now. Okay, and this is because this machine currently is not part of a domain, and this machine is not a domain controller. Okay, to use Active Directory, to store our zone database within Active Directory, the machine has to be a domain controller. Okay, and that's not what we're dealing with right now. So, and that's, again, something we'll deal with in Lab 3. We're going to set up a Active Directory integrated zone. For right now, though, let's keep our top default option primary zone and click Next. The zone name, this is going to be what we choose to use for names in our company. So we've decided already, since the company name is wiredbraincoffee.com, that's going to be the DNS name that we choose to use as well. Okay, and of course you can use anything you want here, especially on an internal network. You know, you could choose anything in an internal network, and it's not really going to conflict with any public namespace. On the internet, okay, I can use Wiredbrain Coffee because Train Signal has registered this domain name, you know, with the internet governing body. Okay. Otherwise, you know, I couldn't just choose to use Microsoft.com. Okay, that name is obviously already taken, and I wouldn't be able to use that on the public internet. If I wanted to use it here privately, though, no big deal. We're just not going to get anybody resolving names on the internet to us. Okay, so I've selected wiredbraincoffee.com. I click Next. And the next screen allows us to specify the file name for this DNS database. Okay, keep in mind that once we create this zone, it's creating a database file, and we're going to populate this with information. So what do we want to name it? Well, we could click Use this existing file, and this would basically allow us to go out and pull an existing file out there, but we don't have one. So we're going to choose this top option, and this is the default name. You can change it if you want to. I really don't recommend it. There's no reason to change it. And this is what people would be looking for, another administrator or consultant, let's say, if they came in and were trying to manage your DNS database on your network. Okay, and notice what happens here. We take our domain name, wiredbraincoffee.com, and we just add the .dns to it, and that forms our file name right here, just the .dns extension. Okay, next selection. Do we want to use dynamic updates? Okay, you can specify that this DNS zone accepts secure, non-secure, or no dynamic updates. Okay, and the secure option's not available to us because, as you see here, it's only available for Active Directory integrated zones, and we don't have Active Directory on this network. So our second options are to do not allow dynamic updates. Okay, and a dynamic update, if you're not familiar with it, is just where a client machine is able to connect to the DNS server and automatically register its name and IP address. It's a huge time saver, great new feature in Windows 2000 and now Server 2003, but it's not the most secure thing in the world. So if this is for a private zone, like we're dealing with right now, we could probably get away with doing this and it wouldn't be that big of a security risk. If we're setting up this DNS server, though, for the internet, a public DNS namespace, you definitely do not want to do unsecure dynamic updates, this option right here. Okay, and it tells us right here, this option is a significant security vulnerability because updates can be accepted from untrusted sources. Okay, so for right now, we're going to leave this bottom option selected. We're going to keep our system secure out of the box or after the configuration. It will change this if need be. So I'm going to click Next. Okay, and as you can see, that's pretty much it. So once I click Finish here, our zone is now set up. I can expand this zone, and just like we saw in Windows 2000, we get 3 records by default. We have our Start of Authority record, our name server record, and then a host record is automatically created for server 1, this machine right here, because this is the DNS server. Okay, we're going to talk more about the Start of Authority in the next video, Lab 2. But this name server record, this is created right here to tell us who is authoritative for the wiredbraincoffee.com zone. Okay, and it specifies some machine named server 1 is. Okay, and then here we actually have a host record for server 1. This is how we resolve names to IP addresses. So if somebody wanted to talk to server 1, they could ping server 1. Okay, it's going to find server 1 and resolve that down to an IP address, and this then would be returned to the DNS client who is requesting that service. Okay, and this is exactly what we can do. If we wanted to, we'll create another record right now for server 2. Okay, and to do that, we just need to right-click anywhere here. I just right-clicked on the white portion down below, and it pops up this dialog box. There's all sorts of different ways we could do this. We can come up here to Action, New Host. Okay, so you can probably right-click over here. Yep, New Host. So however you want to do this. Okay, so I'm going to create a new host record. And notice it's an A in parentheses. These are also referred to as A records. These are the most common records you'll be creating. And ideally, in a Windows 2000 or 2003 network, every machine on your network is going to have a host record. That's how it's identified and then found on the network using this DNS namespace. Okay, so we'll create one like we said for server 2. Okay, and you can see right here it automatically fills in our fully qualified domain name. Why does it do that? Well, because we're creating it within this Wired Brain Coffee zone. If we created it in some other zone that we might have configured, it would be whatever that zone was here. And then we have to also specify the IP address of this machine. Okay, and that's the IP address of server 2. So I can click Add Host here if I want. We'll talk about this option here in a second after we've created our reverse lookup zones. So let's go ahead and click this. And we can see that it tells us the host record was successfully created. Now, clicking OK, some people get confused and think that their entry got wiped out here. It didn't. It's just allowing you to enter multiple host records here. Okay, so if you have another entry that you want to create, this is when you would do it. Just keep clicking Add Host until you're done. When we're done, obviously we're going to click Done down here, and we can see that the work actually did take place. Here's a host record, okay, for server 2. And here's the IP address, 192.168.1.200. Okay, let's talk about reverse lookup zones now. Okay, reverse lookup zones. Okay, if I right-click on reverse lookup zone, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Go ahead and go through and create a new zone. Okay, and before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about why we use reverse lookup zones. reverse lookup zones, first off, are not required. We don't have to create these. If you want DNS to work properly on the public network or on your internal network for Active Directory, a reverse lookup zone is really not required. They're used for troubleshooting purposes, though. They can simplify the process of trying to identify exactly what IP address belongs to a name. It's reversing the process. You know, with a forward lookup zone, we're taking a name and we're resolving it to an IP address. With a reverse lookup zone, we're taking an IP address and we're resolving that back to a name. Okay? Smaller networks are not so important. We're going to go ahead and create one anyway, though. We're going to follow the same procedure we really did with the forward lookup zone. Okay, we're going to create a primary zone. Click Next. And then here we have to identify the network ID of the network that we're working with. Okay, and this network ID on this network is 192.168.1. Okay, and notice that this third or fourth octet here is grayed out. This will never be filled in, so it's grayed out just so there's no confusion. And then just so you realize, if you have a different network ID, let's say that you're working on a 10 dot network, and the IP addresses of machines, you know, for example, are 10.1.1.1, okay, you may see something like this. Okay, you might have 10.0. Oops. Okay, something along these lines. Okay, but we're working here today with a 192.168.1 network ID. Okay, and it tells us right here, the network ID is the portion of the IP address that belongs to this zone. Enter the network ID in its normal, not reversed order. And if you look down here, this is the actual name of the reverse lookup zone. It's going to create a file or zone record with this name, 1.168.192.in.addr.arpa. Okay, and this is just the format that is necessary for a reverse lookup zone to work. Okay, so it's much simpler. Instead of coming down here and specifying the name yourself, you know, make it easy and just enter in your network ID up here like we had before. Okay, and it creates that name automatically for you. Notice it does reverse the digits. 192.168.1, 1.168.192 is reversed. Okay, let's click Next. Creates a file with this name, so it's the zone name here, .dns, just like for a forward lookup zone. Okay, we have that same option. Do we want dynamic updates, or do we want no dynamic updates, which is a more secure choice? We're going to stick with security right now. Click Next. Okay, and then Finish to finish it off. Okay, and here we see we have this reverse lookup zone. It's very similar in that we have a start of authority record created, a name server record. The one thing we didn't get, however, was this host record that was automatically created here. Okay, there wasn't a record created for server 1. Okay, so we're going to have to do that manually right now. And what we do is same thing, right click within this white portion, and notice that we don't have the choice of even creating a host record. And that is because in a reverse lookup zone, we use PTR records or pointer records. Okay, pointer records, just a different name, same concept. Okay, so I click pointer record, and now I'm going to specify the IP address of server 1. So remember that that's 100.192.168.1.100. Okay, and now I have to identify, this is the IP address, well, what computer name, host name, does that belong to? If I click Browse, what I can do now is go search for that host record. And what I'm doing here is I'm browsing through, here's the actual server name. This is confusing when people first see it. So here's a server named Server 1. Okay, and I want to look within my forward lookup zones. And then here's one of the forward lookup zones I have configured. There may be, 5, 10, 100 different forward lookup zones you might have on a machine. So I open this up, and then lo and behold, there's server 1. Okay, so that 1.100 IP address matches up to this host record. Okay, and you're going to see that here in a second. It's gonna link this IP address and this name together and form a pointer or PTR record here within our zone. Okay, we're going to create one more host record. Now remember, we created create a PTR record. We created a host record for server 2. So to do this, we need to right click down here, just like we just did, pointer record. Now it's going to be 200 for the IP address, and we're going to browse for that machine. If we wanted to, though, let's say that we knew the fully qualified domain name, we could, of course, do something like this, server2.wiredbrain, coffee.com, type that whole thing out. I prefer, okay, the clicking method. Less mistakes, less likely to make mistakes. It's real simple here. Just select server 2, populates this whole thing for us, server2.wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, click OK, and we are done with that. Now, no big deal when we create 2 host records with the associated PTR records, but what about when we have a network of 100 different machines? Much more of a pain. Okay, and one thing we can do, we'll call this a basic automation task, is when we're creating host records to automatically create the associated PTR record. So now what we'll do is we'll create a host record for our XP1 machine, which is our Windows XP client machine where we're recording these videos, remember. So I type in XP1, and then down here where it says IP address, we're going to enter in the IP address of the XP1 machine, 192.168.1.1. Now, create associated pointer record. When I do this, check this box and click Add Host. What it does for me, it creates this host record as I would expect, and as it has done for the other records, but it also should create a reverse lookup record. Okay, and what we can do is reload our zone here. Okay, and we see by reloading it, it's kind of refreshing it and going back out and checking the file again. And we see that we do have that PTR record that was automatically created for us. Okay, so that'll definitely speed up the process if you are maintaining a reverse lookup zone. Okay, so something you should definitely want to focus on doing. Okay, now that we have that configured, we should have our basic DNS set up ready to go. And even before we configure these host records, I don't want you to think that these host records here or these PTR records have anything to necessarily do with this, but I want to show you something regarding DNS. Let me cancel that actually. I just want to minimize this. Here we go. Okay, so we're still sitting on server 1. This is our DNS server where we've installed DNS. Now, once we've done this, let's take a look at what happens if we connect out to the internet. Okay, can we connect out to the internet at this time? Okay, and we're just going to go to msn.com here again. Okay, and right now you see that it is opening this page. Okay, and these are all security settings in 2003. And we are able to connect out to the internet. Okay, but one thing that's not happening is we don't have our network settings configured correctly. So we're able to connect out to the internet, but if we started trying to do local name resolutions, it's not going to work appropriately. Okay, and you're not familiar with this command yet. We'll talk about it more here in a second. But if I do an NS lookup, okay, shows me right here that I'm still connected out to the Earthlink servers. Earthlink was actually bought out Mindspring several years ago, so these servers are still named with the Mindspring domain name. But remember, I just created a host record a second ago for server 2. If I enter that in and try to resolve that using this Mindspring DNS server, of course it's not going to find it. This is a public DNS server. You know, I'm going out on the internet and asking it if it knows about this server 2 machine. Okay, there's no way it's going to find that. Server 2 is on our local network. Okay, and this is a real important concept. When we configure DNS on a local network, all the machines on that local network should be pointing to a local DNS server. You're no longer going to point your machines out to the internet because then you won't be able to resolve local names. Okay, so that's what we're going to do right now. Even on this DNS server itself, it needs to change its preferred DNS server. So we're going to go back in here to the IP settings, and here you see that public IP address we were referring to. It's not going to point to itself, so I got to change this to its own IP address, 192.168.1.100. Okay, I'm going to click OK here. Okay, and now what it's basically saying is, anytime you want to resolve a name, talk to yourself, look in your own database. And it seems kind of obvious, but that is a setting you have to configure. Okay, now we're going to run this NS lookup command here again, and now look who it's talking to. Okay, now we're basically saying, when we want to resolve a name, let's check here on this local system here first. Let's not bother going out to that Earthlink server. Okay, and now if I enter in some name like we did a second ago, server 2, okay, look what it tells me. It reveals the actual name right here. The IP address of server 2 is 192.168.1.200. Okay, now what happens a lot of times though when we do this, you may have come across this situation yourself. You start coming up in this trade-off scenario. This isn't the perfect example, but let's say at home you're configuring an XP machine and you're not sure whether or not you should configure that machine to have its DNS pointing to a public DNS server or a private DNS server on your network. Okay, you need to have it always configured to point to the private DNS server. And I'll point that out to you. We're going to go back to the XP machine here in a second, and we will configure that. But you always have to have it point to the private DNS server, and then set up the DNS server so it's forwarding any DNS requests that are public requests out to the internet. Okay, and this machine right now, even though it's pointing to itself, okay, should actually be able to get out to the internet still. Okay, and this is something that we want to talk about and explain why that would be. Okay, and it's taken a second here, but it looks like it's resolving this. Okay, yep, we're back out to MSN again, and just to make sure you don't think it's cached here, we'll go out to Google, a website that we have not been to yet here. Okay, so it's opening up Google right now. Okay, and you see that we're able to successfully make it out to the Google website. Okay, now why is this? You know, we're pointing here locally. If I look into my local DNS database, you may or may not be familiar with the mechanics of how DNS works at this point, but we'll get more and more in depth on that. Well, I'm looking into the forward lookup zones in this machine, and if I look at Wired Brain Coffee, this isn't going to do it. I mean, this doesn't say google.com. This isn't going to resolve Google's IP address for me. Okay, and the reason, anytime you set up on a server, anytime you set up DNS, it creates what's called a root hints file. Okay, it's part of the DNS software. If we go over here to root hints, we see that we have these fully qualified domain names and we have public IP addresses. Okay, and these root hints here, when we're looking at these are public DNS servers. And a DNS server is configured to automatically go out and communicate with these root hints out on the internet. Okay, so right now when we're trying to resolve the name www.google.com, Server 1 is not able to resolve this because the only names it can resolve are names that have Wired Brain Coffee in them. So what it does is it goes out and it contacts one of these root servers. So let's assume that it went out to this first one, 192.33.4.12, and it basically says, I'm trying to resolve www.google.com. Okay, and what happens here, these root hints start off the whole DNS name resolution process. And they don't do all the work for them, but they do get the ball rolling, and eventually, this DNS server ends up getting the information that it needed. It resolves that name, and it's able then to connect out to that web server that it was trying to connect to. Okay, so long story short here, when you install and configure DNS without doing another thing, you actually have an internet-capable resolving machine here. Okay, so we're going to go back to NS lookup here again. Okay, and we showed this before. Remember we did server 2? So we're able to resolve names locally. How about a name out on the internet? Okay, and this time we'll try Microsoft.com. Okay, and it took a little bit of time here, but notice what it did. It popped up some answers for us, and it's because Microsoft has several different DNS servers. www servers is what we got. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different IP addresses. So if we were to start going out to www.microsoft.com, we would basically be load balanced between these 8 different servers. One thing I will point out now, we'll stress this again later, is this was a non-authoritative answer. Okay, and the reason it's not authoritative, well, we tried looking here. Server 1 tried consulting its own forward lookup zones first. Did not find those, so then it went out to the internet and started looking on the internet. And we found an answer, but from another DNS server. Okay, we had to go ask a different DNS server to end up coming up with these results. And that's why we got a non-authoritative answer, because server 1 didn't do the work, essentially. Okay, next we're going to connect back over to our client machine. So we're just going to go ahead and disconnect this session. And now we're sitting back here on XP1, and we're really going to look at similar information that we were just looking at there. But now let's take a look at it from a client perspective. Okay, so I'm trying to resolve names and connect to local resources here. And this really is, it's not really that big of a problem when we're talking about just a workgroup environment. But on an XP client machine that's part of a domain environment, you have to be able to have local DNS capabilities. Otherwise, all sorts of stuff is not going to work properly. Okay, your login scripts and other group policies, all sorts of stuff that you need on a day-to-day basis won't work. Okay, but if you don't have your DNS server configured, then you can't get out to the internet. So it's kind of a trade-off situation. And I talk to a lot of students who just kind of flip that setting back and forth. When they need to connect to the internet, they change it to the internet setting. When they need to connect to a local resource, they change that DNS setting back to a local setting. Well, that's not the way it works. Okay, the way it best works is to go in here, not here, but to here, and set this up correctly. Okay, and remember, when we're dealing with local DNS, never will we have a situation where we have the preferred DNS server pointing out to the internet, okay, on the client machine here. So who are we pointing to? We're going to point it to server 1, who's located at 192.168.1.100. Okay, and you see that right there. Another thing, this is probably a good time to talk about this. Here's the second most popular thing I think people do, a preferred and an alternate DNS server. So what people tend to do is, well, here I'll put my local resource, 192.168.1.100, and here's where I'm going to put my public IP address in, that 207.69.188.187 number we talked about before. This does not work either, okay? So don't even try it. You may think it works because every once in a while maybe a cached result comes up or something, but this does not work. When we have a preferred DNS server, what your machine's configured to do is go out and check with the preferred DNS server to see if it is available. If this machine responds, okay, so the server's up and running, it's going to consult with this machine and this machine only. Even if it gets a bad answer, okay? So even if you go out and you say, I want to resolve www.google.com, and this DNS server can't give it an IP address, it doesn't do the job for it, it's not going to go down to the alternate DNS server. That's not how DNS is configured to work. This alternate DNS server only comes into play if this DNS server is just flat out not available at all. So I query this IP address and that machine just doesn't respond back to me. Nothing, okay? It doesn't get back to me at all. Then we'll try this alternate DNS server, okay? So it's not a try this and this. You know, we don't use these collectively. So this is not the appropriate setting. And in a situation like this, where currently we only have one DNS server, you leave this blank. There's nothing that should go in here. If we have a second DNS server configured locally on our network, then we could configure this. And that's what's going to happen. In the next lab, we're going to actually add server 2 as another DNS server, and then we can configure this. Okay, so we'll click OK here. Okay, and then here in a second, we're going to run nslookup. Okay, and we see here it resolves the name, server1.wiredbraincoffee.com. It's telling us this is the server, this is our DNS server. Hey, it works. Here's the IP address of it. Great. Okay, let's try and connect out to a server resource. Give me the IP address for Google. Oops, got to spell that correctly first. Okay, and see we get IP addresses for the Google web servers. Well, let's try the Microsoft one once again. Okay, same thing happens. We get answers for that. Let's try, how about server 2? Okay, and then here we see, for some reason, server 2 didn't work. We're not able to resolve IP addresses for server 2. Wonder why that is. What about XP1, this machine? Okay, same thing's happening. Server1.wiredbraincoffee can't find XP1, server failed. Okay, and this kind of leads us to next point, something we need to do here locally on this machine. Okay, and that's to change our primary DNS suffix. Okay, we're going to have to change that just like we did on the DNS server. Okay, now this would have worked if we put in the fully qualified domain name. For example, server2.wiredbraincoffee.com. Now we're able to actually get that IP address because we typed out the full name. Okay, if we type out the same thing for XP1, okay, it resolves it once again. We're able to get an IP address. So that is indeed working. Okay, but because the primary DNS suffix on this XP machine is blank, there's nothing set here. Okay, see the full computer name, XP1.nothing. that basically means that this machine is at the top level. So when we do a NS lookup for, like we did before, just a server 2 without doing the fully qualified domain name, what ends up happening, we don't add that on automatically. We just add on server 2 and we search, we don't find anything. Okay, and we would also find out when we go to dynamic updates, you'll see that this process of not having the primary DNS suffix configured will mess up our dynamic updates, because this machine right here is going to try to register itself with the no zone, basically the root zone here. There is no wiredbraincoffee.com here configured. Okay, and we'll check that out. I think what we'll do, we'll set it up correctly here in XP1. When we get over to server 2 in our next lab, we're not going to configure that primary DNS suffix right away originally, and we'll see how it messes things up when we try to configure that. Okay, so we're going to go in here, and we're going to have to go to, what do we want to do? Oops, change is what I want to do. Then go to more, and we're going to add in that wiredbraincoffee.com DNS suffix, okay? Primary DNS suffix. So I click OK again, click OK a third time, and it's time to restart this computer. Okay, before I restart, I'm going to have to stop this video because this is where we're actually recording from, and the video will just quit right in the middle. So I'm going to stop this video. Once this machine boots back up again, we will start the video back up right away. Okay, XP1 has rebooted. What we're going to do now is just take a look at a couple things. We're going to start with that NS lookup command that we were looking at before. Okay, now remember when we entered in server 2 before, or even XP1, we didn't get a proper name resolution. Okay, remember it failed, didn't give us the right thing. And the reason right now is because when we enter in server 2, it automatically appends wiredbraincoffee.com because this is now our primary DNS suffix. Okay, we just configure that. If we go to the properties of this machine, computer name, we see right here the full name of this computer is xp1.wiredbraincoffee.com. So any name resolution we do, it's going to be assuming that we automatically are going to add on wiredbraincoffee.com to the namespace, okay, to the actual computer name. We should be able to do the same thing here for XP1 without having to do anything else. It automatically will resolve this name, pulling this information from our DNS server, server 1. It basically queries that. Here's the name we are attempting to resolve, and then here's the IP address that's retrieved or returned back to us. Okay, and the same thing holds true. You know, if you wanted to resolve Google, we can't just type in www, the name of the computer there. Okay, as you can see right there, it attempts to go and find this www name, but it doesn't find anything. Okay, so furthermore, just like we showed you before, we have to put in the fully qualified domain name. So www.google.com. Okay, and then we're able to actually resolve that information. Okay, so that's why it's important to change that primary DNS suffix. Now, another reason why the primary DNS suffix is so important is because of dynamic updates. Okay, and we're going to connect over to server 1 right now and take a look at what we're talking about with this. So we're just forming a remote desktop connection over to server 1 here. Okay, and here on server 1, we're going to go back into the DNS console and take a look at what we're referring to. Now, here on the forward lookup zone, wiredbraincoffee.com, we see that we have our host records as we talked about before. But what would be nice is if we could have records that were dynamically updated. Now remember, we're going to have quite a few clients here, so when new machines get new IP addresses and we add new machines to the network, we'd like for these machines to automatically register their IP addresses so we don't have to come in here and manually create host records for each of our different entries. I mean, what a pain to have to come in here and go new, host, and set these up one by one for all the different computers out there in our network. I mean, you may have 500,000 different computers. So what we can do is enable what's called dynamic DNS or dynamic updates. To do this, we need to right-click on the zone. We go under the properties of the zone, and here where it says dynamic updates, this reads a little bit different than it did in Windows 2000, where it basically said no, yes, or secure. Here we have none, meaning no, dynamic updates are currently disabled, or we can turn this on to non-secure and secure. Okay, and what this is referring to here, well, depending upon what type of zone we're running is going to control whether or not these are secure or non-secure. Right now, since we're running a standard primary, we're not running Active Directory integrated zones, we're going to have a non-secure dynamic update. Now, this isn't really that big of a deal because we're going to be running this locally here on a network, and we really don't have that much problem with hackers trying to poison our DNS database here. So internally on a network, not something I would worry too much about when it comes to the non-secure portion. Okay, so we're going to leave this enabled, and now we click OK. And now dynamic updates, as simple as that, are turned on this particular zone. Now what should happen is when we re-register our IP address with server 1, it should automatically update XP1's host record here within our zone. So let's go take a look at that and see how that works. Okay, so back here in XP1, we're just going to go over to network connections. Okay, and we're going to go to TCP/IP, and we're going to change the default IP address we started with. We're just going to set this up to 192.168.1.11. Okay, and if I click OK here, click OK a second time, what we're going to do is take a look at a couple of different things. Number one, we're going to go back over to server 1 here in a second, and this is going to, it's timed out basically because we changed the IP address. We'll have to reform that connection over to server 1, so no big deal there. Okay, so here we're looking, and look what's happened automatically without us doing anything. This record was automatically updated and added on the within the wiredbraincoffee.com zone, XP1 at 192.168.1.1. Okay, so just by turning on dynamic updates. If we come back here again, okay, and just so you know where we're back here in XP1. What I'm going to do now is just go right back up here again. We're going to change the IP address once again. Let's assume that this time the IP address is changed to 17. Okay, so if I click OK, OK a second time, let's see if it automatically handles that within our DNS database. Now it's going to disconnect this remote desktop connection again because we just basically disabled and re-enabled the network card. So we'll have to close this and just form a new remote desktop connection back over to server 1, but it's not too much of a hassle here. Okay, so we're reconnected. Notice XP1 is not even listed here within the database. And this isn't a live interactive database. If we close this and then reopen it again, we may see the change has taken place. Okay, still has not. So if we reload the database, okay, still see nothing here. If we give this some time though, what'll happen, this should automatically register within here. Another thing that we can do to force this process along is come back over here to XP1, and we'll run a command that you should be familiar with. If you're trying to force a registration within the DNS database, what you can do is run ipconfig with a special switch called register DNS. Okay, and this is just going to force this machine to re-register with our DNS server. Okay, and it tells us right here, registration of the DNS resource records for all adapters of this computer has been initiated. Okay, and any error should be reported with an event viewer within 15 minutes. Well, it shouldn't take too long. We should be able to find out pretty much right away if this has happened. If we come back over here to server 1, let's try to refresh this. Okay, and we see that it indeed has updated XP1 with its new IP address, 192.168.1.17. Okay, so this is the beauty of dynamic updates. And going back to that primary DNS suffix, it's very important. It's got to match this, otherwise dynamic updates is not going to work. Okay, let's talk about that a little bit more. So we're going back here to our primary DNS suffix. If this is not added, the .wiredbraincoffee.com, XP1 will go over to its configured DNS server. Okay, and remember that's what we configured over here. Okay, 192.168.1.100. So XP1 goes out, connects over to this server, server 1, and when it connects over to server 1, it tries to register itself with it, and if it doesn't have this appended to it, what will end up happening is it won't be able to register with anybody because there is no root that XP1 can register with. Okay, so it really needs to know what its full name is, and that's why we add on that primary DNS suffix. Now that we have added the primary DNS suffix of wiredbraincoffee.com, XP1, as you see here, and we've saw several times now, has no problem registering itself with this server. Okay, so no issues there. So we can close this. And from here what we'll do is just set this IP address back to what it was again. And we'll look at it from a little bit different perspective. Same thing, but we're just going to put this back. Instead of connecting back over to server 1, we'll just run the ns lookup command once again, and we'll see if that ends up working for us. So I come here to my command prompt. I'm going to run ipconfig. I'm going to re-register with this, force this to happen. Okay. And then if I run ns lookup right now, just going to our name server and asking it to do a lookup, I should be able to just type in xp1 as we did before, and it should reveal the IP address, okay, that's current, and that's 192.168.1.1. So very, very handy. It's nice to have dynamic updates turned on, and now you see that we're able to get up-to-the-date information on your DNS. Okay, so your two main benefits: one, it's going to save you a lot of manual entry, and two, your DNS database is going to be a lot fresher. You won't have any stale entries within your database that no longer reflect accurate IP addresses. Okay, that wraps up Lab 1. We'll see you back here real soon when we get into Lab 2 and start talking about zone transfers between DNS servers.